Good evening, everybody. Before I start, I just want to say thank you for coming tonight. And the lecture this evening is dedicated to all those who've supported me over the years, and that's friends, colleagues, and students, and made academia a joyful space where that's been possible. I appreciate it and thank you. Those of you who are in the room, those of you who are online, and others as well, thank you very much. So, my research over the last 15 years has considered how inequalities are reproduced in educational spaces. And the area I've focused on the most is race inequality. And issues such as white privilege and theories such as critical race theory, racialization have become more mainstream now than they were, say, 20 years ago when I first started researching them. There's more academic work in the field, and there's also more attention paid to these topics in the mainstream as well by the media and politicians. The notion of white privilege and critical race theory have even had considerable political attention, as you'll all probably now be aware, although not necessarily from the point of view of aiming to eradicate or address racial inequalities. In fact, we've had the Conservative Equalities Minister, Prime Minister, arguing that critical race theory, teaching about critical race theory and white privilege, actually stokes divisions. It's worth remembering that this is quite a tired argument, that mentioning the problem creates the problem. Also, until it was mentioned in Parliament, most people had never heard of critical race theory. I'll call it CRT from now on, because in fact it hasn't really made inroads into British schools, and it's been rather a niche theory of structural racism in academia up to now. So it's rather a surprise to hear it mentioned in Parliament. It's a niche theory of structural racism used to analyse and explore how structural racism works and to address it. So, why do we need to understand how race inequality works in education? Why is this even important? Firstly, inequalities persist despite narratives of meritocracy and equality. Secondly, racism is often misunderstood as only overt or deliberate or individual acts, rather than structural or systemic or multi-layered. Thirdly, it's deeply embedded in social structures, including educational structures, and that makes it difficult to identify, especially for those who are actually privileged by race. I'll explain more about that later. And fourthly, if we don't understand how it operates, it's difficult to address. The kind of research questions that my work focuses on are such as the following. Why is racial privilege and disadvantage important? How does it operate in education? How does it interact with other social structures to have social and educational impact? How can we analyse race inequality so that we can better understand and then address that inequality? Positionality is quite an important part of any research. And so I'll say at the beginning, the social positionality of a researcher and the research participants needs to be considered at every stage in research. And positionality is intersectional. That means it's classed, it's raced, it's gendered, and other. So in particular, when researching issues of race inequality, I need to consider my own racial positionality. I'm positioned as white, and I benefit from white privilege in many different forms, and others position me as white. So in researching issues such as white privilege, I can't step out of that. That's unrealistic. But on the other hand, I also wouldn't argue that we need to leave research on racial oppression to those who are oppressed by it. That isn't right either. White people do have a role to play, and I hope that my role is that my work plays a role in challenging racial inequality. So tonight I'm going to talk about some examples from my work. I'm going to talk about race and white privilege as a structure, race and racism as a hegemonic norm, and racism as a desubjectifier. So those are the three areas I'll focus on. And in each of those, I'll provide examples of projects that I've been involved in or led. So on securitization and militarization, on refugees, vocational education, careers education, and I'll finish with COVID schooling policy. Okay, so looking at race and white privilege as a structure, the theory that I've worked with the most is critical race theory, which I've adapted and changed and used different tenets of over the years. Now, critical race theory actually originated in the US 40 or 50 years ago as critical legal studies by a group of scholars who were asking why, although the civil rights movement had started to ensure that formally there were equal rights for everybody, in fact, African Americans still did not, in reality, enjoy equal rights. They're still disadvantaged. This theory has been picked up by others, particularly in education, and become critical race theory. In order to answer the question, why do African Americans still experience disadvantage, the critical race theorists came up with a series of tenets. Critical race theory is a massive body of work. There are lots of tenets, but the ones which I've used the most are the following. Race inequality is structurally embedded in society and in all cultural, social, and political relations. Race is socially constructed. Race inequality is difficult to spot due to its structural nature. So the goal of CRT is to expose racism and to show how it works and develop strategies to address it. Critical race theorists also argue that it's impossible to achieve goals such as meritocracy if society is unequal. Race inequality can be addressed in a number of ways, including via interest convergence. That's when the interests of the dominant majority coincide with minorities, and also activism. Critical race theorists also refer to terms such as white privilege and white supremacy. And by white supremacy, they're not necessarily talking about apartheid, although that may be an aspect of a white supremacist society. What white privilege and white supremacy are about, and they use white supremacy because it tends to really focus on the hegemony of whiteness in society. It's the flip side of racism. It's the idea that if one group in society is disadvantaged, that there's another group which is privileged automatically. So what this offers us is a structural framework for analysing racism, for how it's maintained despite efforts to eradicate it. It moves us on from descriptions of racism. It challenges traditional notions of racism as deliberate and overt because it also addresses unwitting racism that we're not necessarily aware of, unconscious racism. It's important to point out that white privilege doesn't necessarily refer to skin color. This isn't about skin color, it's about structures, a structure of domination and oppression. And it's also important to point out that not all people who are classified as white in society um, are privileged in other ways. So white people are not class privileged; they're not gender privileged necessarily. Um, it's about racial privilege. There is often confusion around white privilege. People tend to think it's about socioeconomic privilege. That's not. That's a different thing. There could be links, of course, but we're not talking about class privilege or socioeconomic privilege. And importantly, systems and institutions which claim to be neutral and fair often actually do, often unwittingly, reproduce disadvantages, including race inequality. Okay, so an example here is an analysis I did of the Troops to Teachers education programme from a few years ago now, developed by the Department for Education. This was a teacher education programme introduced in 2013, aimed to fast track ex-service people into teaching. The idea was they wouldn't need a university degree necessarily to teach. They wouldn't need to be subject specialists, and they would provide military-style discipline. And they would bring all these skills with them. Wouldn't necessarily need to learn them. So, taking a little look at the policy, it initially appears racially neutral. There's an example up here. I've kind of honed in on a few important phrases here. It appears to be addressing a shortage of teachers and a route to employment for ex-army. So it appears to be a good idea on the face of it. It appears to be objective and target all young people. However, if you look more carefully, it actually seems to be aimed at poor young people, disadvantaged young people, and racially subordinated young people, because it's drawing on long-standing racial stereotypes which are common in the popular imagination. So you can see the word gangs, underclass, offenders, prisons, poverty of ambition, truancy exclusion. These are long-standing stereotypes which are classed and raced, and also gendered, because there's elements of masculinity in here as well. We need more male teachers, it says. It's Michael Gove that's saying it, who then was the Secretary of State for Education, to provide children who often lack male role models at home. And again, that kind of draws on stereotypes, often of Black families who are led by a female in the imagination. So rather than this, a critical education with subject specialists, the idea was to provide a military education for these people, authoritarian, perhaps patriarchal. These young people are portrayed as being in need of containment and discipline. It seems to be intended, in fact, if you look closely, at a programme for the at disadvantage, perhaps inner city young people, because wealthier, perhaps whiter schools will continue to get those qualified teachers, and potentially as well, it's a gendered notion, as I've just said. I suppose the other side to this is that it needs to be seen perhaps in the context of the creation of an increasingly militarized society that was particularly important at this time when I was writing it, but actually that has proved in some ways to be true. Society is becoming more militarized. So you could argue the context was part of a wider move to increase ideological support for foreign wars, which of course are often imperialist in nature. It could be about military recruitment, bringing soldiers into schools. And in fact, the German version of it is quite explicit about that. it could be about creating a militarized environment in schools, getting young people used to prison, remembering that we still have the largest prison population I've said here in the EU, and it was in the EU when I did this project. Obviously, we're not there now, but we still have a very large prison population. And it's disproportionately minority ethnic, the prison population as well. So it's raced at every level, and the context is also raced. The significance of this project was that it demonstrated the racial implications of a project which was thought of as neutral. And it also demonstrates how racism is structural and white privilege is structural, embedded in policy. So it both fuels education policy and is fueled by education policy. My next example is about the work I've done on refugees. And that has shown that not only are there barriers to refugees in Europe in accessing education, as is reasonably well known, but in fact, these barriers are structural and they're racialized. So first of all, reporting on a project from, again, a few years ago with other colleagues, funded by CEDEFOP, which is the arm of the EU which funds vocational education research. This examined the barriers to vocational education and training for adult refugees to European countries. And we conducted expert interviews across 6 different countries, including the UK. And what we found were a lot of similarities across these different countries. The vet systems were inflexible. There were restrictions on paid work, training and study for refugees, patchy provision of advice and guidance, dispersal policies, which actually prevented refugees from accessing areas where they could get training and employment. There was a lack of official programs to accredit qualifications or recognise informal learning. There's very patchy language provision, and it's underfunded, and there's a lack of specific provision for women. Now, you might argue some of those things affect us all, and of course they do. But cumulatively, they severely affect refugees. Combining this then with emerging ideas from Germany, which was also part of this study, of a kind of mostly unacknowledged a European system of white privilege, which is shaped by a history of colonialism, and also drawing on historical analyses from the US, where analyses of the labour market which have shown that there's a division of occupations along racial lines, which have resulted in the term worker itself being not only gendered but raced. What we found was that these 2 aspects interact. So the systems for accessing vocational education and laws around migration and refugees actually contribute to and compound social exclusion for refugees. They're working together to make it worse. And these VET programs, despite differences, I mean, these are generalizations, but despite differences in different countries, ultimately they tended to reinforce existing racial hierarchies in each country. So what we found was, like all education systems then, vocational education constitutes not only a barrier to social inclusion, but it's actually a key institution of social regulation, and perhaps may even be integral to ensuring that white privilege is protected in the labour market to a certain extent. So the significance of this then, is that the next slide? Ah, yes. The significance of this then is that it challenged those prevailing ideas that barriers are individual. Again, showing how structural these issues are, or that they're just to do with arrangements for refugees. No, they're to do with the policies interacting. And it also challenged the idea, and this is particularly common in Europe, but you do get it here as well, that the disadvantaged position of refugees is based more on their lack of citizenship, for example, or religion, or their migration background. It might be due to all those things, but it's also based on white privilege within our education systems. The recent project that I've been doing on refugees is on secondary education. And some of you, I've been talking to some of you about this project already. So this is a study of secondary education policy in this country and in Germany with my colleague Anke Wischmann. And here I'm just going to talk about the English side of the study. But so there's data in this country which suggests that those from a refugee background are very disadvantaged in education. Now, we don't collect clear data on refugees, so it's actually quite hard to get the figures on the exact nature of the disadvantage and the extent of the disadvantage. But one of the figures that's useful is that only 3% of those from refugee backgrounds go to university, for example. That's a very low percentage. There is a gap in research that we're filling at the moment, because although we do know that refugees are disadvantaged in the education system, we haven't really looked at how that's a racialized notion. We haven't made that connection very well in research. So myself and my colleague are analysing the two systems to see how these different elements interact. We found a complete absence of policy. I mean, this is just England now. Okay, so these don't apply to Germany. Some of them might, but I'm not presenting the German data. Absence of policy targeted specifically at refugees in education, at young refugees. There's nothing. And there's no kind of national integration program providing advice or bespoke support. Now, there is in Germany, so that's interesting. I'm not saying it works well in Germany, but there is something. So it shows that there can be something. We provide very inadequate language support, especially for young people. So, for example, we don't have a formal system of tweaking the language used in tests to establish young newcomers' ability or level in subject areas. It could be done, but we don't do it. There's evidence that some schools are avoiding taking refugees because they're oversubscribed, meaning that less well-subscribed schools are overstretched. And that is very difficult. We have a neoliberal system of school choice, and there's plenty of research which says that middle-class parents know how to play that system, move to an area to get into certain schools. But obviously refugees are coming fresh into that system, and they're being disadvantaged within that because they don't have the social capital needed in this country to select those schools, and anyway they're being refused entry. And of course then there's the wider immigration policies that play into that, such as the age assessments for young people, again in this country in particular, which mean that while young children's age is assessed, they can't go to school. So they're missing months and months of school. Dispersal policies, meaning that very often families are being moved about, resulting in disruption. Lack of training for educators as well, meaning that previous specialisms have been lost. Okay, so we brought all that together And we use critical race theory to look at the extent that this is racialized. And we combined that with the notion of racist nativism, which is an American idea, but it describes that link between racism and immigration. The positioning of the native as white and the non-native as raced, as well as white people as native and racialized minorities as non-native. That connection. And what that enabled us to understand is that the disadvantaging of refugees as non-natives, which they are in all of those points, is actually also having a racializing effect. So they're being othered, excluded, and disadvantaged by the system, and those are all aspects of racialization as well. So that in turn, so the nativism is leading to racialization as well, and that in turn reproduces existing native privilege and white norms. So what this does is it provides insight into that structural way in which immigration status and racialization are interlinked in education and reproduce each other. I'm now going to move on to look at a more post-structural approach. So I've talked about structural approaches. That's my book there, Judith Butler, Race and Education, and I talk about this in the book. So we've talked about white privilege and racial inequality being a structure, but it's also a norm, a hegemonic norm in society, a norm which is often unspoken. And from a post-structural point of view, a norm subjectivates. It creates subjects. That's what norms do. Judith Butler tends to be best known for her work on gender and sexuality, but it's also more broadly about power and how power works in society. And that's what I'm drawing on for this, and using those arguments to look at race and racism. So, what does a Butlerian approach enable? A deconstruction of essentialized notions of race and privilege. It allows us to examine the social construction of race and privilege and oppression. It provides a challenge to the existence of racial specificity, an exploration of racial positioning and racial location and how this can shift, and an understanding of how white privilege is actually continually reproduced. It's not just there, work is being done to reproduce it. But it also allows us to investigate how these notions of race have such potency. So although race is socially constructed, it's believed in, and the work that we're doing to reproduce it creates a racist reality and makes people believe that race is real somehow. And so what this Butlerian approach does is allow us to unpick that a bit. So Butler's work theorizes the process by which identities are produced. It provides a view of race not as a pre-given, not as a fixed identity, or as a fixed or essentialized category. She would argue that race, like gender, is made real through the repeated citation of norms. So she argues that norms they're often considered to be pre-existing categories, but in fact they're created by our citations that can be explicit or implicit. So we are rendered a subject through norms. That's basically her argument. It's not a conscious process. Everybody is implicated because every individual is subjectivated right from the very formation of ourselves as subjects. So what using Judith Butler brings us to is that the idea of white privilege, therefore, is maintained and produced and reproduced through discourses, through acts, through practices, which are citing these norms. And this is kind of an extension of the idea of racial stereotyping, which people are more familiar with. So for Butler, race would be a subjectifying force. It creates identities, it creates roles. In a project I did on apprenticeships, conducted again with my colleague, Professor Vishman, we looked at racialized norms in apprenticeship systems in England and Germany. And we had a research question. Why do statistics from both England and Germany suggest that the percentage of minority ethnic young people or young people from migrant backgrounds, which is how they're referred to in Germany, in apprenticeships is low, despite major differences in the respective labour markets and the respective apprenticeship traditions? We looked at the existing literature on this because it was assumed that the answer is known. And what was said was the following. I'm not saying these are true. This is what research says. These young people, minoritized young people, choose more academic routes. They underachieve in compulsory education. They have language difficulties. They lack networks to get into work. They have insufficient careers education and advice to be able to know what choices to make. The images and language used in marketing materials tends to give the idea that a typical apprentice is white, and discrimination, which is probably likely to be linked to all the other things that we've said. Now, there's some evidence in some ways for all of these aspects, but we questioned it. More research found when we connected these studies with other studies that have shown that the labour market historically is racially segmented, and in Britain that skilled workers have traditionally been regarded as white and male, and minority ethnic people and women historically regarded as unsuitable for skilled work, a pattern which actually continued post 1945, despite workers arriving from India, Pakistan, and the Caribbean. These in general, new arrivals were doing secondary sector jobs in the labour market, which fueled these ideas that skilled work is done by men and by white men. And then in Germany, that colonial structures influenced the treatment of guest workers who helped build New Germany after 1945 and regarded as cheap labour, and also not given citizenship rights in Germany. Taking all of these different theories into account, what we found was that this is where these normative ideas of apprentices was coming from. This normative image of the apprentice is white or white native, also male, of course, in some areas, and very, very gendered as well. But there's plenty of work on that. And that prevents some people from even considering becoming an apprentice, and it also prevents employers from considering minority ethnic people as apprentices. And this is the post-structural element. So this norm is constituting the subject. This is how it's working. The concept of what it means to be an apprentice is actually white itself, and that's establishing the norm by which the subject is known. So, as with all norms, it's not a neutral norm. It's gendered, it's raced, and it's historically produced. And these norms, we argued in our study, are still um, driving. They still have some force in vocational education systems in the labour market today. And that is kind of fueling a white privilege in some areas of higher, more highly regarded apprenticeships. It's very visible in Germany, but also in this country. So you've got two countries, excuse me, with very different vocational education systems, and yet the racial norms are very similar. And if we want to address this at a structural level, the argument we made was, fair enough, all the other research on this, but what it was missing was the importance of the norms, and we need to look at how the norms are reproduced. Another example about the norms, in my work on careers education and aspirations. So this was a project funded by Aldgate and All Hallows, which is a charity in London, and it looked at programs which aim to raise pupil aspirations. So these have become kind of institutionalized in secondary education, the idea of raising aspirations. As other people have argued, this is based on the discourse that young people's aspirations are too low, and that their low aspirations is responsible for the fact that they're disadvantaged. So I've got a quote here from ex-Prime Minister Cameron. And again, I've highlighted some important ideas which I think illustrate what I'm trying to say here. This idea of a culture of low expectations, transcending your background, overcome circumstances, succeeding on your own terms, the toxic culture of low expectations, the lack of ambition of every child. So what this is a classic neoliberal discourse. Structural issues such as poverty, for example, are presented as being dependent on an individual attitude rather than other wider structural issues. So the lack of success in neoliberal terms here is regarded as a lack of aspiration, or maybe a lack of ambition, or a lack of individualism, a lack of that want to transcend your background. Also portrayed as, if you see that last line, which has held this country back. So the poor are actually being being blamed for damage to the economy in this case, because they're so inactive economically. And if you follow that logic, in order to improve economic productivity, they need to be taught to aspire more highly, make better choices, improve their lifestyles. And this is what's been institutionalized in schools, this idea that they need to, if only we just aspired a bit higher, then we'd sort out our economic problems. I've got some interview data here. So this is from a case study at a school where I did a longitudinal study over 5 years. It's a single-sex school, girls only, comprehensive school. A high proportion of the pupils receive free school meals, and a high proportion are of minority ethnic heritage, mostly from the local Bangladeshi population, but also Somali and mixed heritage as well. So here's a teacher interview. CC is me. So what's the main aim of the Student Aspirations programme? Teacher says, the girls all want to go down the road to the local university. They never think about going outside this city. We need to encourage them to go further afield, but many of their families don't want them to. Is that right? It's like coming to work in a different country working here. I worked in a school where there were lots of black children before, but these are quieter and don't give their opinion as much. So in this conversation, a quick analysis, there's lots to say, but for the purposes of this lecture, the pupils are being perceived as unaspirational, lacking in aspiration by the teacher here. They're also seen as subservient to family, so not having their own opinion. But why is that? And if you look at the next example, which is from a student focus group, and just consider that for one moment. Student one, and they make it seem like we have to make our own choices. And I said, what do you mean? Like there's no one who can help us make the choice we want to make. They were like, don't do what your family do just because they did. Don't do what your friends did. That's the only advice they gave. My older sister and my older brother, they're twins. They've just done their GCSEs. Because our choices were coming up. So I told them I wanted to choose drama. And my sister was saying how hard it is, stuff like that. My cousin brother, I asked him what he found easy and what he found hard. He liked business. And I was thinking, well, I should take business. And my sister said, well, I wanted to do dance and drama. And I asked my sister and she said, go ahead, do what you want. Okay, so there's lots going on here. Picking out two norms, because this is about norms. Picking out these two norms which are being operationalized in these conversations. So first of all, there's one hegemonic norm which is about that neoliberal individual aspiration that I've just talked about. So it's operating actually quite explicitly in the original in the first conversation. So these programs tend to be these student aspiration programs. They tend to be considered as part of careers education, but actually what's really going on is there's an element of teaching children to be neoliberal. And that's implicit in this idea that neoliberal learners aspire, they're rational, they're autonomous, they're individual, they're agentic, they make individual choices. The other norm here is a race norm, the notion of whiteness, and also of middle classness, which is feeding in here as a hegemonic norm, which perceives these mostly Muslim brown females as other in society, as subservient to family, as passive. And there's also an element of what might be referred to as a white savior within that norm as well, which is being picked up by the teacher, I think. So in this conversation, the students are not talking about making choices alone. They're talking about collaborative choices. And giving me lots of examples of how helpful it was to them to get the perspective of their siblings and cousins. And if we view that through the work of Judith Butler, where agency and decision-making are collaborative, it could certainly be argued that the students are demonstrating agency because they're seeking help and advice from their family and informing themselves through the experience of others. But if we read it along the previous example where the teacher sees the students as subservient, it looks like that collective agency isn't intelligible to the teacher. The teacher's not recognizing it. So these two norms, firstly, the racial frame constituting these young females as not agentic, and secondly, the neoliberal frame of careers education, which constitutes aspiration as individual. According to these narratives, these Muslim students, mostly Muslim, are almost being viewed as demonstrating their lack of freedom because they're not aspiring individually. So they remain not intelligible to the teacher as agentic students. So race is functioning here as a hegemonic norm, masking the teacher's own role, because the teacher has power here to a certain extent, reproducing those racialized structures. We're looking at norms interacting with each other, which is quite complex to be able to read what's happening here. And the teacher's perceptions, if we're going to address these perceptions, we can't do that without taking these different norms into account. Finally, I'm going to look at racism and white privilege as a desubjectifier. And this is also drawing on the work of Butler. So desubjectivation, and we've talked a little bit about that in some ways in the last example, but It's when the subject isn't intelligible or isn't viable as a full subject, or it's about the removal of the subject's recognition as a legitimate subject. So, subjects who don't fit with dominant norms are often unintelligible, as we've just said, but they're all often unintelligible as full subjects. So, constituted, as Butler would argue, beyond an imagined community, and via that mechanism, marginalised or oppressed. And Butler would argue this process goes beyond subjects being not socially acceptable. Their status as a subject is drawn into question. So, subjectivation can be a form of existence and survival. One can be desubjectivated, as in constituted as less than fully human, because we're only recognized as human in relation to social norms. And this may sound extreme, but for Butler, this is actually how oppression works, through the creation of not viable subjects. And she talks about this idea of normative schemes of intelligibility establishing what will and will not be human, what will, as she calls it, be a livable life for those of you who know Butler, and what will be a grievable death. Whose death do we grieve more? And therefore, who is being assigned the status of full subject or less full subject? This can be explicit, implicit, and it can also be a legal issue. It can be legally regulated or not. So full subject can also be removed from an individual through a lack of rights. For example, if a law is differentially applied, thinking back to critical race theory, which is also relevant here, but some people then not being fully protected by that law, even though it's the same law. So we'll come to that in a minute. So as an example, Butler in her work considered the effects of the killing of mostly unarmed Black people on the streets in the US at the hands of mostly white police officers. That's the example she gives. So there's this danger of police violence on the streets, particularly against Black people, which is on an everyday basis, and the often lack of consequences for the perpetrators, for the police. This has created a situation where the law, it's the same law, but it's being applied differently in how it plays out on racial grounds, because that's where the difference is. So basically, even though it's the same law, the law is being applied differently. And Butler argues that white supremacy functions through a process of desubjectivation of racially minoritized groups. Of course, not all Black people directly experience this violence. It's the threat of violence, which means that the law is being applied differently. The differential power of the law, that's what's doing the desubjectifying. Creating an idea of disposability and unviability and ungrievability, which is where the Black Lives Matter movement came from, drawing on these arguments. Now, the idea of people of color in the US being treated less than human is not new. It's not Butler that pointed this out. Of course, it's not, and it's not me that's pointing this out. But where Butler's work does differ from a lot of other work is it focuses on the desubjectivation of the individual via their social position. And this kind of extends the notion of race as a social construction, because it's going right to the heart of how the subject is being formed on an everyday basis. So my final argument here is around, or my final example for this argument is around COVID schooling policy. So, very recent work this. So what I looked at here was secondary schooling policy in this country in response to the pandemic, with regards to the impact on race inequality. So as we know, the policy that the UK government followed, its different U-turns and everything that happened, meant that disadvantaged children suffered disproportionately in terms of their access to learning and their outcomes. But we tend to not recognize the fact that there's also a racialized element to this. And in pointing this out, I am in no way saying that other disadvantaged groups were not disadvantaged, they were, but there's a racialized element to this. So during the pandemic then, there was lots of attention paid to issues of health and race. And you'll remember that, of course. Widespread reporting of the fact that in this country, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people have been more likely to die of COVID than white people. And it's important just to remember what the reasons for this are. So research has shown, not my research, but other research from health, high infection rates because minority ethnic population groups often work in healthcare settings and other frontline work, or in low paid and precarious roles, and therefore are perhaps less able to isolate when required or less able to socially distance. Seems weird talking about this now, doesn't it? So it was so recent, and yet we're not talking about social distancing anymore, really. Also, racialized minorities are more likely to live in overcrowded housing, and therefore, again, less likely to be able to socially distance. Figures show that workers in insecure jobs were more than twice as likely to die than average of COVID, and minority ethnic individuals were more likely to occupy those roles. And also that minority ethnic people have higher rates of death once infected, due to higher incidence of existing health issues. Now, these are just a few reasons, but the point here is that this is systemic, that the health issues are systemic. They're already in the system. They're due to entrenched inequalities in the health system that are there anyway and are exacerbated by the pandemic. There are other issues to talk about here, actually, but just today, I just want to focus on what I actually found, and I was looking at existing data and synthesizing it. In fact, the government's response to the pandemic for schooling increased the risk to life, particularly for minority ethnic families, keeping in mind the existing risks. So firstly, keeping schools open when cases are high. So slow closure of schools in March 2020, keeping them open again in autumn 2020. Despite denials, opening schools at that time was shown to increase transmission of the virus and therefore lead to higher cases overall. So that put everybody at increased risk. But particularly for families such as minority ethnic families who were already at increased risk, that risk was exacerbated. Secondly, children obviously had to access learning online, more possible for better off children, but many children from less wealthy homes and a large proportion of those are minority ethnic had little access to a device. The government was supposed to provide them with a device, but less than half of those that they ordered ever arrived. They eventually issued guidelines saying children who cannot learn remotely due to a lack of devices should attend school. And so we had a kind of dual approach there, forcing families to choose between risking potentially their whole family's health and risking their children's schooling and potentially pushing them towards sending their children to school to prevent them from missing out on learning and therefore risking their own health. And then thirdly, on the return to school after the second lockdown, masks and twice weekly COVID tests were not made compulsory. They were in many other countries for that time. And at that time, there was increased scientific evidence which suggested that mask wearing was actually affecting, to a certain extent, the transmission of the virus. And therefore, that increased the risk as well. So, obviously, the risk of ill health and death there increased via the schooling policy for everybody, but particularly for racially minoritized families whose risks of ill health and death were higher than the average population anyway. And what can be argued here is that this is an example of desubjectivation. Now, there's a real risk to extra exposure, so exposure to death. There's also that threat that I talked about. It's the threat of exposure to death, the threat which matters here. Because it's the same policy, but it's affecting people differently along racial lines as well as on class lines. So minority ethnic people don't have the same protection as white people under that law because of the existing differential vulnerabilities. So what this shows then is that we need to take into account, when we're thinking about these things, into the way that health policy and education policy work together, which they weren't really doing at the time, and they could have done better. And they're interacting with existing structural vulnerabilities. You can't understand the effects of one without looking at the effects of the other. And this is the kind of thing that should be taken into account when we're planning for future pandemics. Finally, I just wanted to draw out a few points about what we can do about this. And I know with each of them, I've made a suggestion of what can be done. But broadly, there are insights which can help us address or try and address race inequality, obviously depending on one's own social location and one's own role and what interventions are possible, especially from the point of view of a researcher, because that's where I'm coming from on this. So some points which have come out of my work, that we need to avoid the impossible position of neutrality, reject that notion of whiteness as norm. And there are obviously different ways of doing these are broad. Avoid a kind of fetishistic gaze upon those who are socially located as racial others. Criticize, problematize the structures of white privilege in education. Take into account that these structures exist as a context, they're already there. They shape our access to resources, they're shaping policies as we've seen, and they will shape our response to policies. Allies, for example, white allies, should mainly aim to support this work, not always to lead. And then ideas which draw upon poststructural work, because it's important. I think these two different theoretical traditions provide us with slightly different angles that are all important. So reject and problematize essentialized notions of race. And I say that with a caveat because strategic essentialization is very important politically, can be very important, but post-structuralists might reject it. Be aware that research and educational practices traditionally have reproduced racial inequalities, and that's the context that we're working in, and we risk doing the same if we're not very careful. We need to examine how our own actions and our own practices and the norms that we cite, as I've mentioned, sometimes unwittingly, but try and be aware of it, they constitute our positions, they constitute the discourses, and this can be explicit and implicit. We need to remember that we're all subjectivated by norms if we're following Butler, and those norms are raced, gendered, classed, they're intersectional. It's not conscious, but the more we understand and the more we work at it, perhaps we can do our bit. And also from a Butlerian point of view, because Butler would argue identity categories are unstable and white privilege needs to be reproduced in order to function. That obviously means, within that idea, that obviously means that we don't actually have to reproduce it. So there's an idea, there's a grain of hope there that we could aim to destabilize it and to break that automatic link that there is so often between whiteness and privilege. I'll leave it there. Thank you.